Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me along here this evening. I'm from the School of Psychology in the University of Birmingham here, and my background really is in neuropsychology, that is, in working with people who have had typically some kind of brain damage and trying to understand the nature of their problems. But I was invited along here tonight to talk about two things, really, and so this talk has two parts. The first part is, at least for me, rather an unusual thing, which is asking the question about what factors make a great night out, and in particular, a great night out for student populations. So these were to find out for people between 18 and 25 what they considered made a great night out. And that's a sort of step into consumer psychology. So what psychologists try and do to find out about people's decision making. I'll talk about that little part of the work first to give a background for looking at then the brain processes that actually seem to be involved when we make complex decisions about, for instance, where should we go tonight? Would we go to restaurant X or restaurant Y, and so forth? And so this second part is really more what you might call neuroscience, and particular cognitive neuroscience, which is about cognition and decision making and the underlying neural processes involved in that. So I'll be talking about two things as I make my way through the talk. For us, this little journey started out coming up to Christmas last year when we were approached by Bacardi, actually, who came along to the university and said, we're interested in finding out what students think make a great night out. And in particular, can you scientifically prove these factors involved? And that was an unusual question for us because we don't really do work like that at all. But the fact that Bacardi came along with a little bit of commission money, etc., made the decision making for us a little bit easier than it might otherwise have been. And so we set ourselves the problem of trying how scientifically to find out what students thought would be the important factors and how they would weigh those factors up in their decision making. And just to begin with that, we started out by asking little focus groups, so very sort of popular mechanism for finding out people's initial thoughts, and we simply asked them what factors would they associate with a good night out, what factors with a bad night out, and we just tried to list as many things as we could. So that involved them saying, well, if they did some kind of extra activity, like going skating together or going dancing, which seemed particularly popular amongst our students, then that seemed to be something that they often listed. Going to a nice venue seemed to be something that was important. Having good food, for instance, was an important factor. Or not having some activity the next day was another thing that they listed across quite a number of the focus groups as something that would take into account as to whether they would like the evening before and what a difference that would make. So basically, but I think many people working in consumer psychology would just set out, first of all, to get a sample of the things that people think contribute to a night out. We then asked large numbers of students to try and think of an occasion when they had a really good night out, an occasion when they had quite a good night out, but not as good as the first one, an occasion when it was actually quite a poor night out, or an occasion when they really hated it. Terrible evening. And then we asked them to rate how important these factors were to contributing to that night. So we listed all the kinds of things like doing an extra activity, taking alcohol, having a nice meal, the importance of the venue, the ease of transport and so forth, and simply got lots of ratings of what the students thought would contribute to the good night out, the moderate night out, the bad night out, and so forth. And so what you end up with here is something like this on lots and lots of factors, lots of dimensions. So here the dimension is what they would do the next day, and these are the quality of the nights that they were rating. So you get lots of numbers, lots of complex kind of graphs like this that you could plot. And you find that, for instance, quite a few people here rate as contributing to a very good night out. That would be a 7 if they didn't have anything much to do the next day. Okay, so a lot of people contributed there, or a lot of people, you see a high column here, would rate it as being a poor night out if they had something very important to do the previous day. So you can see that there's some kind of order to all of these numbers that you can then generate. And then you can ask various kinds of things. You can ask, to what extent does the variation in this factor, so the way these numbers go up and down, predict the quality of the night out? So what of these factors predict whether it's going to be given a 7, a really good night, or what would predict it being given a 1, a really poor night out? And so we did that. We listed all of these factors, and we put them into a nice little computer program that generated a complex regression equation in which here we have the quality of the night, and this is the equation that accounted for most of the variation between a good night and a bad night. Now the thing is, don't worry about what this is at all. It just illustrates that you can boil anything down to an equation if you wanted to, really. And these are the factors that go into this equation. So Q makes it sound very scientific here. The quality of the night out, the presence of alcohol, this factor here, doing an extra activity in dancing, these two factors here. If you're with friends or if you meet new people, these factors here. Or if, for instance, you have to rise early the next day. And you'll note that all of these things have positive values. So taking some degree of alcohol the night before, doing extra activities, meeting friends, these are all positive. Having to rise the next day gets a negative factor in this equation. That's bad for the quality of the night. And this boils down to, for instance, the take-home message, which is what Bacardi were interested in this instance, were if you took some alcohol, that was good, but actually, you'll notice here that this is a square root function, so the more alcohol you have, basically, the less this gives to your quality. Yeah, so as you keep going up and up, you get fewer and fewer gains. So it's quite sophisticated. The more people who drink, actually, the less good the evening would gradually come out to be. It was good if you took part in some extra activity, and that's shown here in the yellow. That's the extra activity things. If you're with friends or you meet new people, these are good things, and that's shown by this part of the equation. And as I said before, definitely you do not have to get up for the activity the next day, otherwise that's bad news. And why I say definitely there is if you look at these little numbers that go at the front of each factor, you see that this number here, 0.35, is quite big compared with some of these other numbers before these other factors. So what that means is that this has a very strong influence on the quality of the night. Basically, if you have to get up the next day, that's really bad for what the students thought would be their good night out. So maybe we had some diligent students who were worried about getting to the 9 o'clock lecture the next morning. One hopes so. So that's just a little introduction, really, to look at how in consumer psychology people might go about getting ratings and trying to put into a summary form the kinds of information people use when they make a complicated decision like what would make a great night out. And you see here this kind of factor, with all of these little things being listed and different kinds of weights given to each of those factors, which indicates their importance for this factor here, the decision. And my take-home message really is not that this is the be-all and end-all of what makes a great night out, but really to illustrate by this kind of formula that when we make decisions in everyday life, which all of us do all the time, these decisions mean taking the relative weights of all sorts of different factors and kind of weighing them up together. For you, something might be really important and have a very strong weight, but maybe not for somebody else. And this enables these factors to contribute to the final outcome. And you might imagine our brains computing different kinds of quality of night measures. And then weighing up, if I go to restaurant X, I'll go to have a value of this. If I go to a restaurant Y, I'll have a value of this. And your brain might be doing that all the time, perhaps while you're driving and so forth. So complex things are going on as we carry out such decisions, even though that seems to be very characteristic of our everyday life. So what I'm particularly interested in, and my background is in neuropsychology and neuroscience, is to look at how the brain actually deals with complicated things like this, weighing up all of the odds to do X, to do Y, and so forth, and which bits of our brain are involved when we make these decisions. Now, one long-standing way that's been used in neuroscience to understand how the brain carries out various activities is to look at how these functions may break down after people have had a brain lesion, where very unfortunately they may start to have a problem with something. But for the scientists, that's interesting because it reveals something about the process that would normally go on. And this is the science of neuropsychology, really, trying to understand something about normal processes from looking at cases of brain lesion. And so I'm going to begin in the neuropsychology by looking at a very early case of somebody who suffered a brain lesion. And this was somebody called Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a worker on the railways. And in the 1860s, he suffered a terrible accident. There was an explosion as they were putting down the rails, and a pinion shot out and went through the top of his head, you can see here, and through his skull and came out under his cheekbone here. Amazingly, Phineas survived. However, he was a changed man. And although this is a reconstruction of how the injury would have been, following the lesion, he was described as having various problems. I'd just like people to note this quote, because I think this is a lovely example of scientific writing in the 1860s that, unfortunately, is very little done today. So Harlow, 1868, writes, "The equilibrium between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising plans that are no sooner arranged than abandoned." However, prior to this terrible injury that Phineas suffered, he was perfectly normal. He wasn't somebody who went around swearing and producing these profanities. He was somebody who could make up his mind quickly and efficiently. But for some reason, the brain damage that he suffered because of this accident led to these kinds of problems occurring. And a case like this, the case of Phineas Gage, suggests that damage to the particular part of the brain that he suffered damage to, which is the frontal lobes, so the parts of the cortex here, the front of the brain, suggests that these lobes seem to play an important role in decision making and in the way we go about making up our minds in everyday life, because Phineas started to have enormous problems never being able to make up his mind about what he was doing, and so forth. Now, one of the interesting things about this part of the brain is that, perhaps more than any other area of the brain, it's changed over evolution. What we see here is an MRI scan, a magnetic resonance image scan, of a rhesus monkey brain. And here we have an MRI scan of Homo sapiens, so human brain. And there are many changes that take place between the monkey brain here and the human brain, but probably the largest changes are to the structures here. So this is the back of the head, and this is the front, and the frontal lobes are here. And in the monkey, the frontal lobe structures are relatively small and underdeveloped. In humans, they're much more richly developed. So they're more extensive in terms of the number of neurons present, and they're much more highly convoluted and folded over and complex. So you might think that during human evolution, the development of the frontal lobes and whatever they do for us in everyday life seems to have been important. It's something that may differentiate us from perhaps other primates. So the frontal lobes are evolutionarily relatively recent. Interestingly, they are also recent in our own evolution. That is, relative to other parts of the brain, the frontal lobes develop their full structures late. And only by early adolescence do the frontal lobes become fully structured. So in children, for instance, you see cases that in some respects can look a little like adult patients with frontal lobe lesions. That is, and I'll show you some examples, the frontal lobes play a less controlling role in children than hopefully they do in adults. So, the example of Phineas Gage suggests that damage to the frontal lobes can lead to problems in complex decision making. And there are many other examples of this in the neuropsychology literature. So here's a slightly more recent example, documented by a neurologist, Damasio. And this was a case of an accountant who developed a tumor occupying the middle parts of his frontal lobes. This tumor was removed, which allowed him to go on living, but he then developed a whole range of behavioral problems. Now, interestingly, the accountant could still do very well on general tests of intelligence. So, for instance, when his IQ was measured, he continued to have a very high IQ. An IQ of 130 is very nearly Mensa class. So this is an intelligent person, articulate, could explain his reasoning and so forth. However, following the removal of his tumour, he started to make very odd decisions compared with the cautious accountancy-type decisions he made before. So he went into partnership with somebody who was previously sacked for impropriety within his firm. He very quickly lost all his money and went bankrupt. He became divorced from his wife. He remarried against all advice given to him by his friends and relatives, don't do this, and then divorced again very quickly afterwards. Sounds like some people one might know, really. And perhaps like Phineas Gage, his ability to make rational decisions became compromised. So, for instance, it's reported that going to a restaurant took hours. He discussed in minute detail what was on the menu, what the seating plan, how that would be. He would drive to the restaurants, this one, and then to another one, and then to another one on the other side of town to check out how busy they were, without, for instance, thinking that by the time he got to the other one, the state of the first one would change, and so forth. So this kind of rational decision-making starts to break down. But those kinds of decisions in everyday life are quite difficult to analyse. And in order to become a little more analytic, to find out what's going on in such cases, it's easier to look at some slightly simpler examples. And so some of the examples that psychologists have tried to analyse in a bit more detail concern problems in much more mundane tasks like making a cup of tea or making toast and so forth. That is, tasks that would predict whether people would successfully go home from hospital or not, or would they start having problems or become a risk. And so what I have here is a little video of a patient that we're working with. This is somebody who's had a frontal lobe damage following a stroke. And she's going to be asked here how to make a cup of coffee and to illustrate making a cup of coffee. And so you'll see her just sitting.
What I want to show me.
So she's
that
asked.
That is then added to that. Then that is added to that. Then that is added to. And then put your water here. And if you like sugar, add sugar. In 1, 2, or 3. Mix it together. And then if it's too hot, you don't do it. If it's hot, you don't drink it.
So you have finished making a cup of coffee? Okay.
Simple.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's an example, and if I just play again parts of that, you'll see many little errors that she makes going through. So, for instance, having put the spoon in the coffee, she then puts the spoon towards the milk carton, or indeed into the milk carton, and starts to stir it.
And then put your water here. And if you like sugar, add sugar.
She goes to get the sugar, and then she's drawn to it and eats it, instead of putting it in the cup, and so forth. So even in simpler examples of everyday life, people's behaviour can start to become problematic following damage to the frontal lobes. So you saw she started to stir the milk carton with the spoon. She ate the sugar. And one thing that you start to see after frontal lobe damage is a kind of automatic responding to the environment. The sugar is in front of her, she automatically reached and put it in her mouth. And this has been called responding to an affordance. The idea is that objects in the world can afford certain actions to us. For instance, a cup in front of us affords a reaching action that is associated with it. And after frontal lobe damage, it becomes very difficult to stop yourself doing this. And this was first reported by a French neurologist called Lermite in the early 1980s. And he described a patient who Lermite was testing him, and Lermite put Lermite's glasses down on the table in front of him. And the patient reached down and picked them up and put them on him, on the patient. So Lermite thought this was rather strange, and he had both reading and far sight glasses. So he put another pair of glasses down, and the patient then reached down and put them on over the glasses that they were already wearing. Somebody else was called along, put their glasses down, the patient reached and put those on. So what you see here is a kind of automatic response to something in front that drives the action in a way that's not really being controlled by the niceties of the situation. The fact that you're not supposed to do that no longer controls the behaviour of the patient. And we've carried out similar things with really very simple tasks. This is work carried out by Jane Riddock, who's actually in the audience here, and it just, I think, illustrates what you can learn from really simple procedures. So we carry out a task like this. The patient would be sitting or standing like I am, and we'd put a cup down on the table. So you could put the cup, for instance, shown there, to the left of the patient with its handle on the left. And we told the patient, if the cup's on your left side, pick it up with your left hand. So the patient was supposed to pick it up with the left hand both when it was that way round and that way round. It's on the left. If you put the cup on the right, pick it up with your right hand. Doesn't matter if the handle's on the right or the left, pick it up with your right hand. And so we went through that, explained it to the patient, and then said, go. So it was a kind of game. You put the cup down quickly, say, pick it up. And what happens is, if the cup was, for instance, shown that way round to the right hand, handle on the right, fine. To the left hand, handle on the left, fine. But if you have these cases where the cup is like this, it's on the left, so the patient should use their left hand. They don't. And the right hand would grab the cup and take it. Interestingly, after the patient had done that, and we said, well, what was the rule? What did we just tell you? And they would say, well, if it's on the left, pick it up with my left hand. So in some way, they would know the rule, but what they couldn't do was to implement it and control this automatic response to the environment. The handles on the right use the right hand. Interestingly, the slide doesn't show it very well, but if you turn the cup over like this, so it's not quite the usual cup, you carry out the same game, but now the patient would reach with the left hand and pick the cup up. And that's interesting because it indicates that the familiarity of the environment is what's driving the action. And even though it might be an awkward way to pick the cup up, the patient would still do that, provided the cup didn't drive the action so strongly. So these so-called utilization errors seem to be induced by an overlearnt response to the environment. In that case, it wasn't due to the awkwardness of the action, but due to the environment affording actions. And the frontal lobes seem to be important in stopping ourselves respond in this automatic way to the environment and allowing us to respond in perhaps a slightly more rational or more complex way according to our longer term goals of what we want to achieve. And I'll give another little example of this, not coming from neuropsychology now, but from brain imaging. And this is going to concern something called the framing effect, about the way people make decisions and which parts of the brain are involved in making the decisions. This particular study will use functional brain imaging and uses magnetic resonance imager, shown here. This is actually the new machine that's recently been put into Birmingham University, a very high strength magnet that allows us to start measuring activity in the brain as it's happening and as people are making decisions. The framing question goes like this. You start off a trial in an experiment, and you're told, for instance, you receive £50. You're then given a choice. You're told that you can either keep £20 or you can gamble. Okay? And these indicates the odds of winning compared to the odds of losing in red. So what would you rather do? Would you rather keep the £20 or would you rather gamble? What would you like to do? You'd like to keep the £20. Okay. Or take a case like this. I'll give you £50 and now you can lose £30 or you can gamble. What would you like to do now? You'd like to lose the 30. Oh. Who would like to lose the 30 or who would like to gamble? Who'd like to gamble? You'd gamble. Okay. Would you have gambled on the £20 one? You would too. Oh, well, you're a gambler then. The point of this is that rationally, this is exactly the same thing. You're going to end up with the same amount of money if you stick here, keep £20, or if you stick here. But when you ask people the question in slightly different ways, people tend to choose to gamble more if the question's framed in terms of a loss. You'll lose £30, or would you like to gamble? Most people would then say, I'll gamble. Compared to when you say, keep £20 or gamble. So the way you frame the question influences the decisions people will make. Losing stuff is kind of hurtful and people don't want to do it. But it's not rational, that's the point. So, here's a little study where they gave individuals these tests while they measured what was happening in their brains while people made the decisions. And this is the brain activity when people make the kind of comfortable decision. That is, when they decide to decide to gamble when the question is phrased as a loss. For instance, lose £30 and they decide I'll gamble. Okay? And the parts of the brain that get very active in that case are shown here. Now, this is a side view of the brain. And this part that's active here is actually not part of the cortex on top, but it's actually a subcortical structure called the amygdala. And this is, in evolutionary terms, a very old part of the brain. So when people are making that decision, gamble, if you're going to lose, the amygdala seems to play a very important part. As we've seen, there are lots of individual differences, though, if you ask an audience about whether they gamble or not. And what you have here, in this case here, is just looking at some of these differences between people. This is the percentage of change in the percentage of increase in making a gambling response when you're given the loss framework. So if you're given minus 30, are you more likely to start gambling then? And this is in a study, and this is the number of subjects who are more likely to start gambling down to those who wouldn't be more likely. So you could think of these, for instance, the people who are down this end of the continuum are the kind of Dr. Spotts of this world. That is, these are ultra-rational people. They don't make a decision based on whether it's a loss or not. They make the rational decision. Compared with others who are kind of much more like the Captain Kirks, who might be swayed one way or the other and will take a gamble, etc. And if you look at the brain activity that's associated with these differences in people, that is, which people tend to be a bit more rational and which ones are going on the negative information about loss, for instance, then the brain activity, this is the back of the brain, this is around the front here, and here is the it's called the orbital frontal cortex, but it's a bit of the brain right down here at the front. And the more active this is, then the more rational the decision the person was making. That is, the less swayed they were in the decision about whether it's framed as a loss or a gain. Interestingly, this area is exactly the area where the pin shot through Phineas Gage's head and went down through. The kind of area that stops you responding to whether something's going to be an immediate reward or a loss, and allows you to make a more rational decision about it. So we have an area that's sensitive to information about gains or losses. And this is a very old structure in the subcortex, so actually below the cortex, the amygdala. And we have areas that seem more sensitive to rational decision making, which is the orbitofrontal cortex. And the very last part of this talk, I'm just going to consider how these areas play together. Because you might imagine that if you have loss of the frontal cortex, then this ability to rationalize and also to maybe modulate these more kind of base urges, if you like, from these older subcortical structures becomes compromised. And you see people acting more automatically to the environment in front of them. And for this final example, I'm going to go back to neuropsychology. And this is a study carried out with various groups of patients on what's called a gambling task. And the task goes like this. People are given 4 sets of cards. And they're given, if they choose one set, they're given a certain reward. And that changes them. They keep going through the game, they get rewards, but some of the cards also carry losses, so they'll lose information if they go for that pack. So there are 4 piles. 2 of these piles, let's say the yellow and the red ones, give you some immediate rewards. So the first couple of cards you get a positive reward for. But occasionally you get these very high loss cards in these piles. So gradually, if you kept choosing from these piles, you'd start losing money. So you get some rewards, but big losses. In other cases, you get, let's say these piles, you get a low immediate reward, but overall, it's more, you earn more. So this is kind of like doing a steady job, making the decision to do these things, or do a really high-risk venture. But over time, gambling, you lose. So what do people do in this very simple task? Well, these are control subjects. So this is all of us coming here off the street. This is what happens over time. And this is choosing the disadvantageous pack. That is the ones that give you some immediate reward, but over time you'll lose. And this is choosing the advantageous pack. And what you see is that right at the beginning, people start to go for the ones with these initial rewards. But over time, they realize that they're losing money, and so they stop choosing those and start to choose the others. Does that make sense? So gradually, they're choosing more and more from the piles that are slowly accumulating money. These are results from people with damage to other parts of the brain, but not the frontal cortex. And you see basically the same pattern, this kind of cross over. They start with the high reward but high loss pack, but gradually they shift. They're kind of steady accumulators. People with frontal lobe damage, however, don't. They start off choosing the high reward but disadvantageous pack where they'd lose money, and although they drop a little bit there, they keep on choosing this pack, and they never switch over to going for the steady accumulation. So frontal lobe damage makes people into gamblers. They go for high reward, but they lose, and they're not sensitive there to losing the information. So they're poor at stopping their response to these occasional high rewards, even though actually sometimes the patients can tell you that this pile, this one is over time, I'm losing money choosing that, and then you say, make the next choice, and they go back to it. However, one little thing to note is that before making a choice, normal subjects actually show a very small kind of emotional reaction, which is before they choose particularly the bad cards, they get a little sweaty. And you can measure that with something called a galvanic skin response, but it's a little kind of reaction. And people have argued that that gives you some kind of, like an automatic marker to say, don't do this. Your nervous system is responding, saying, this is going to give you a bad result. And that's then contributes to the decision people make. And one of the interesting things is that when they carried out these studies with the frontal lobe patients who carried on choosing the bad deck of cards, these individuals also failed to show this automatic reaction to it. So they showed no autonomic response to making these bad choices. So it seems that possibly there's no talking between the more primitive part of the brain that's providing this automatic don't do that signal and the frontal lobe that's being damaged in the patients. And so because they're not talking to one another, the patients find it very difficult to alter their behavior. They seem to be cut off from this signal to their rational decisions, and maybe just are responding then to the more primitive reward carried by this older part of the brain. So, in conclusion, I started out talking about consumer psychology, how you take something as complicated as students making up their mind about where they're going to tonight. And you can put that all into a formula, boil the information down that might allow you to predict what makes a better product than another. But in addition to that, when thinking about how the brain goes about deciding between one thing or another, then I think the neuroscience evidence indicates that there are both rational and more primitive aspects of any of our decisions. And very often we have to control the more primitive drives to act immediately to the environment. These primitive aspects seem to relate to old parts of the brain, subcortical structures like the amygdala. The rational aspects seem more controlled by the frontal lobes, although these can be informed by these kind of emotional automatic responses that tell you don't do this or not. And patients with damage to the frontal lobe no longer seem to be sensitive to these kinds of emotional markers. In either way, it seems that deciding on a good night is certainly a complex process and one that the human brain has evolved to control over many thousands of years. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glyn. Does anybody have any questions for Glyn? If I could just start off then, something you touched on earlier on. I was just wondering if you see any clinical differences in people that have tumours in their frontal lobes in terms of how their behaviour changes before surgery.
Yes. So if the tumour starts to occupy space that normally would be held by the neurons in that part, then that in itself can start to damage the neurons or to make them not function so well. So you can have cases where structurally there isn't damage to the frontal lobe, but those neurons are not getting the oxygen supply, for instance, they normally would, and so they're not in a good working state, and so you'll then see the behavioural and the clinical problems that you'll find even after a stroke.
Right, so in some respects that could be a marker for there might be something
Yes,
wrong.
yes, indeed, yeah.
Right. Does anyone else have a question?
The card game, with the
Yeah.
advantageous and disadvantageous cards. And you're saying that participants, they can tell you what the rules of the game are, even though they've been choosing the disadvantageous cards. They tell you the rules, they then immediately go straight back to the disadvantageous card.
Yeah.
Has anyone asked them, why are you doing that? You've just told me that was disadvantageous.
Yes.
And examined that in any sort of way. For
Yeah.
them to,
I mean,
what
what's
those
interesting, it's almost like the rational mind is disconnected from what drives the behaviour. And so very often with such patients, you can get very complicated rationales then develop. And you saw with some of the clinical quotes about Phineas Gage or whatever, that they would come up with very complex reasons about why they're doing things that seem to be an attempt to explain to yourself what's going on. But actually when the behaviour is then driven, it's driven by the high reward they got on the last trial, even though over time they're going to lose money doing that.
The first one about Bacardi I find interesting because I map onto that the consumer buying process. What did Bacardi do with the results of that test? Because I can't see how it links towards alcohol, but not theirs per se.
No, no. So it wasn't particularly advantageous for alcohol actually. So that wasn't a very important factor in what was driving behaviour. So a little, I think they wanted it just for publicity.
I'm just trying to think how they've turned the results of your study into a PR campaign in order to sell more of their own product.
Right. Well, I think, for instance, in the final formula you come up with, or we came up with there, lots of the things that the students listed didn't turn out to really explain what they called a good night and how they rated a good or a bad night.
Or how Bacardi could in fact influence it.
Yeah, but for instance, some of the factors would be, if you met up with your friends, that was strongly rated by the students and a positive thing. So you might think if you were in charge of Bacardi that having some advertising campaign that Bacardi gives this, come with a friend and you will, or whatever. So there might be ways of trying to use that information to actually have then a good night that's then associated with their product.
To make that link,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm assuming Bacardi were hoping that everybody would quote Bacardi as being an important factor in the night out. And Coke, obviously.
Once a tumour has been removed,
Yeah.
the patient's behaviour obviously changes. Is this permanent?
Well, not necessarily, no. So there can be recovery of function, both following a tumour or following a stroke, etc. Where, for instance, with a tumour, as the tumour's increased, the neurons might have become squashed to some degree. And so then removing the tumour allows those neurons to recover to some degree and get a better oxygen supply and so forth. So actually sometimes the behaviour can become better after the removal of the tumour because it stops this kind of squashing process from taking place. And then there's a gradual recovery, often over the first 6 months or something like that. So it's quite a long process, but there can be recovery.
Does anybody else have... Oh, there's one over the other side.
It's a question following on from that, really. In terms of recovery, is there any sort of psychotherapy that actually has been used and proven that actually works to help the patient to rationalise decisions again? Because, you know, the lady with the coffee and after the stroke,
Yeah.
post-onset, after the operation, sort of 6 months, if there's no recovery has happened naturally from the brain healing itself, is there anything that professional can do to actually help the patient?
Yes, I think there is. I think so. So there are two things. One is to try and think through more rationally, but the other side of that coin is to stop, for instance, being so impulsive in the way that you're responding. And so, for instance, in our lab, we're involved in trying to develop techniques to stop patients becoming so impulsive, giving them little exercises where gradually they're given reinforcement for responding, you know, trying to think through a problem a bit more than doing the first thing that comes into their head, and so forth. So people can recover, and I think there are strategies that you can teach to help people not be so impulsive over time. Yes. Yes.
To entice them, you know, to rationalise with them that they're being irrational. Is there a way to help them to rationalise what they're thinking, to know that it is what they're, no, it is a rational thought that they're doing?
Yes. Not sure in that particular case, in those examples, but it's much more the case with following frontal lobe damage that what you get is that sounds like a kind of rational, maybe a slightly odd rationale, but something somebody's thought through and they're trying to keep with that, as opposed to what you see more often, which is actually the patient reaching and eating anything that's in front of them. And what you're trying to do is to modify that and to stop that happening so much. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question before we have to finish up, if anybody has one. No, you've got it, Caroline.
You were saying how the people with the frontal lobe damage tend to exhibit kind of quite gambling behaviour, sort of high-risk behaviour. Is there any comparison between the brains of people with frontal lobe damage and the brains of people who don't have any frontal lobe damage but a tendency towards gambling, particularly addictive gambling? Is there any comparison?
So what you can see here in these simple choice tests, like how sensitive are people to information about losing or gaining, that actually there's a lot of individual differences amongst, this was a normal population of students actually going into the study, and you can see that some people hardly change their response after they've been given a negative, and lots of people make big changes to their responses, and that correlates not with damage but with the activity in the frontal lobes. So people who are showing more active neurons in the frontal lobes are less swayed by the punishment or the reward and are more rational in their decision. So you might imagine that obviously in the normal population there's variation, and variation in the development of the frontal lobes. For instance, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a structure that develops late in childhood. And so you could also imagine that with childhood trauma or various things, malnutrition, etc., that actually this part of the brain doesn't develop quite so well as in other circumstances. So what you see in brain damaged individuals is really the extreme, but within the normal population I do think there's variation.
Well, if there's no more questions, oh, hang on, I'll come over the microphone.
It's just a question of driving. If someone is diagnosed with a tumour in the front lobe,
Yes.
would, even after surgery, they be able to drive again if things like decision making
I think
and irrational behaviour?
I think you can't make a very general answer to that, because it depends very much on where damage is. So the cases I've been talking about are very, like Phineas Gage, are very typically damaged right at the front here in the middle parts. But the frontal lobes are big structures, and there may be damage to other parts that don't produce quite these effects. Also, it depends on the degree of damage. So I think you'd want to take the individual, they go through a test or whatever, and you make this assessment then.